This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on revolutions, religion, and science. Catholic Christendom. Western Roman Catholicism had hoped throughout this entire time to reunite the West with Eastern Byzantium. However, when the Turkish Muslims conquered Byzantium in 1453, that dream vanished. Then, at that point, the Turkish Muslims built an empire, the Ottoman Empire, which grew to control all of northern Africa. This eventually led to an Islamic invasion of Europe in Vienna in 1529. Both of these events were cataclysmic for Catholic Christendom at the time. The notion that the Turkish Muslims could conquer Eastern Byzantium meant that there would never again be a reuniting of the Catholic Church. And on top of that, it looked like at the time that the growing Ottoman Empire with their navy would be able to eventually invade into Europe and take over significant sections of it. The Protestant Reformation. Right after this happened with the Ottoman Empire, an internal threat grew for Catholic Christendom. A Catholic monk named Martin Luther began to criticize Catholic practices like indulgences, pluralism, and priestly corruption. Indulgences were payments at the time that people would make to the Catholic Church, a sort of fees or sort of a charity that they would give to the Catholic Church each week in order to build up Catholic buildings. No, it doesn't sound so bad. In fact, Protestants do that today. But here was the difference. At the time, the Catholic Church was offering that if these payments were made, they could be done as good works that could be built up in order to achieve heaven. Now, this fits very much with the Catholic overall belief system that heaven is achieved both through faith and through good works. If you give indulgences to the church, you're doing good works, so that helps to build up your ability to go into heaven. However, this became incredibly corrupt as it was oftentimes used to pay priests or to pay clerics. Another practice that upset Martin Luther was the notion of pluralism. Within the Catholic Church, there are multiple different orders. For example, within our own school, there are the Jesuits, there are also the Benedictines, and there are numerous other orders. Each one has their own way of worshiping God, and they're considered to be equal but simply different as long as they are within Catholic Christendom. For Martin Luther, this was a problem. He saw this as fragmenting the overall beliefs of the Catholic Church. Then there was just generally priestly corruption. It was known at the time that many priests took a lot of the money that was given for themselves. It was known at the time that there were priests, bishops, and even some popes who had actually participated in having children. This was outside of their priestly ordination. So he eventually posted the 95 Theses, or statements, calling for changes within the Catholic Church. Now notice at this point, Martin Luther really wasn't out to separate from the Catholic Church. He was out to reform it. However, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, summons Luther to the Council of Worms and demanded that Luther recant. It was at this point when Luther decided that he must leave the Catholic Church because he saw that the Catholic Church was unwilling to change its ways. So Luther established Lutheranism, which preached the following solas. Sola Scriptura. One should only go to the Bible in order to discover sacred revelations, not to some sort of priestly mediator. Sola fide. Only faith in God saves, not good works. The belief here was this, that you can't save up enough good works in order to be saved. I mean, think about this. What kind of good work saves you? If you tomorrow give charity, is that enough to save you, or do you need to do something on top of that? Are there particular good works that saves you? And then on top of that too, if good works saves you, how many bad works wouldn't save you, or would turn back those good works? Even more than that, Luther believed that when you went to the Bible actually preached that it was faith, not these good works, that would end up saving you. Also, he believed in priesthood of all believers. Priesthood of all believers basically said that if you look at the Bible, there is no sacred clerical or priestly class that was created. Rather, we are all equal in God's eyes through salvation. Now, this might give you the impression that Luther was a Democrat, meaning that he believed that people should have power, but this was not the case. For example, at one point, the peasants who believed in Lutheranism thought that Luther was preaching democracy, and they rose up in rebellion against German princes in order to gain more power. And Luther called out to these German princes and told them to crush the peasants' rebellion. In other words, Luther was, in the religious sense, more democratic in trying to establish the solas that we were talking about up above, but when it came to politics, he was still very much in favor of the feudalistic society. John Calvin. John Calvin argued that Luther didn't go far enough. Calvin argued that original sin had so corrupted human nature that humans could not choose to do anything good including choosing God. This led Calvin to believe in something called predestination, in which God was the only one who could choose to save a person through regeneration. So what does this mean? Basically, the idea is this. Human beings are so corrupt, they can't do anything good. Not only good works, but they can't even choose to do good. So a human being could claim that they've chosen God, but deep down, they really haven't. So only God would be able to predestine or turn somebody towards being saved. And this process is known as regeneration. Calvin took this then and tried to establish the perfect biblical community within the Netherlands. And this ended up spawning a number of other groups who agreed with him but were in different countries and simply had different names. For example, the Huguenots in France or the Puritans in England. The Anglican break. King Henry VIII of England could not get a son from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now keep in mind, England had just fought a civil war called the War of Roses between two houses, the Lancasters and York. In the end, Lancasters won, establishing the Tudor family in charge of the English nation. Henry VIII feared that he might fall back into a civil war if he could not have a son, so he wanted to get a divorce from Catherine in order to marry Anne Boleyn. But this went against Catholic Church teachings, and the Pope at the time rejected King Henry VIII's request. At that point, Henry VIII decided to break from the Catholic Church and to establish the English Anglican Church. This is extremely important because keep in mind up until now that Martin Luther had been able to establish Lutheranism as a local church and gain protection from local princes. John Calvin was able to establish a small city up in the Netherlands believing in Calvinism. But this is the first time that we have an entire country that has turned away from the Pope and decided to form its own Protestant national identity. The religious wars. The consequence of this was a fight that took place in the Holy Roman Empire, where they fell into a civil war called the 30 Years' War. France also fell into a civil war between the Huguenot Calvinists and the Catholics. Spain, at the time, was under the control of Philip II, and Philip II hoped to become the leader of European Catholicism, and he tried to lead the Spanish Armada against the English Protestants, where the basic ends of support was being given to Protestantism. But he failed. The Spanish Armada reached the English Isles, and at that point it was believed that he was going to win. The English Navy was no match for the Spanish Navy. But as they got into the Channel right around England, a huge weather storm kicked up and destroyed most of the Spanish Armada. That allowed English Protestantism to succeed, and it also allowed at that time period for Protestantism in Northern Europe to succeed. In the end, the way to solve this that the Europeans decided upon was through two treaties. First in France, the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes established religious tolerance in France. The Peace of Westphalia also established religious tolerance for states within Europe in general. Now be careful. This is not the religious tolerance that we know today. This doesn't mean that individuals get to practice whatever religion they want to believe in. Religious tolerance in Europe meant that in every locality, the governor, king, or leader of that area could choose the religion that people believed in. So for example, in Italy, most people were Catholic. So the leaders in Italy would have chosen Catholicism for their area. In the Netherlands, most people were Protestant. So in that area, the leader might choose Protestantism for their particular area. It doesn't mean the individual gets to practice whatever religion they want. It means that the leader of an area gets to practice whatever religion they want. Aristotles Universe. Right before the Protestant Revolution took place, there was also a revolution taking place in science itself. Back during the classical ages, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, had argued that the cosmos was made up of 8 crystalline spheres. They surrounded and rotated perfectly around the center of Earth. He also argued that if you looked up into the heavens, the planets and the stars that rotated around the Earth were perfect bodies in motion. The implications was that there was a perfect order, a circle, which suggests intelligent creativity, an unmovable mover or a god, and that the Earth was at the center of this entire creation, demonstrating that God had a special place for human beings who had a moral conception of the universe. Challenges to Aristotle. However, while this belief really fit nicely first for the Greeks and then eventually Catholic Christendom, it began to fall apart. Nicholas Copernicus was hired by the Pope in order to make a new calendar for the year. Copernicus kept noticing that every time he would do the calendar, he would have days missing, and he finally figured out the problem. He had been making his calendar based upon the notion that the Earth was at the center of the universe. When he switched that around, he found out that the Sun being at the center of the universe made more sense. This was known as a switch from the geocentric or Earth-based theory to the heliocentric or sun-based theory. However, this was then challenged again. Not the notion that the sun was the center of the galaxy, that was accepted, but Johannes Kepler noticed that when he did his calculations, it didn't seem that bodies in motion rotated in a perfect circle around the sun. Rather, they seemed to orbit in an ellipse, or an elongated oval. Now, that may not sound like that big of a deal, but an oval is not a circle, which means it is not perfect. And this challenged the notion of perfection and order in the cosmos. Challenges to Aristotle again. Also, Galileo, using a telescope, showed that the bodies in space, the planets and moons, had blemishes and sunspots. Most likely, we now know these blemishes were because of asteroids or other types of bodies that were hitting each other up in space. Now again, this may not seem like that big of a deal, but it's a huge challenge because it challenges the notion of perfection in the universe and introduces the notion of randomness. And this leads up to Isaac Newton. Now we all know Newton for that general stereotype we have of him, an apple falling on his head and figuring out gravity. Of course, we know that that's not the way this happened, but it does demonstrate overall the general principle that Newton had that he changed things on. Newton showed that the universe operated under natural laws, like the law of gravity, but this had a major challenge. This challenged the idea of God's intervention in the universe over nature, and it changed the metaphor of how the universe operated. Before this, people looked at the universe as operating like a human body, with multiple different cells kind of operating together, and God had created it to work this way. But now, all of a sudden, it looked like the universe was more like a machine, like a car, or like a clock, with basic parts that operated under rules. And it wasn't God's intervention that made it work, but the consistency of these rules. The Philosophes. The scientific revolution provided the context then for people to challenge traditions, especially religious traditions. Now be careful, a lot of these guys actually were Christians and remained Christian throughout their life. However, many of them decided to challenge the notion of sacred scriptures and sacred revelations as not needing to be proven, but simply that rationality would be used afterwards to justify the original truths. For example, René Descartes. Descartes established something called the method of doubt. Descartes argued that we should start by challenging everything. Don't accept anything anybody's ever taught to you. Use your own rationality. Begin with the things you can be certain about, and then start to deduce truths out of those certainties. Another example was Voltaire. Voltaire wasn't a Christian. In fact, strongly was suspicious of the church. He argued that the church was run by clerics who used superstition, not rationality, in order to control people. And Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that the individual should be autonomous in using reason. Now, why would this be the case? For Kant, reason defined us as human beings. It made us different from animals. Well, how can we be sure that we use reason correctly? Well, we have to make sure that there's nobody forcing us into any one belief. We have to use reason all on its own. That means we have to be autonomous. Autonomous means that we have the freedom as an individual to think on our own and come to conclusions based upon reason alone. So the social and political implications of this. This idea of using reason led to major political and social implications. For example, John Locke. John Locke argued that if we use reason, we can create an understanding of what's called natural rights, or a natural society. He argued that reason tells us that we have certain basic rights, like life, liberty, and private property. If you don't believe me, think about this right now. Could you ever conceive of a world in which it would be morally okay to kill an innocent person, or to place people in slavery, or to allow criminals to simply go out and steal somebody's private property? My guess is that you don't feel that way. Your intuition and your rationality tells you that's not the case. Now, it's not because we look to sacred scripture for that to be the case, or even to tradition, or because an authority figure tells us. It's because it makes sense. It's rational. Now, if that's true, if reason can tell us that we have natural rights that are given to us, then where do governments come from? Well, governments are created by people to protect those rights. Therefore, democracy, or what's called the social contract. Another thinker at the time who used reason was Adam Smith. He challenged mercantilism. He argued that if you look at nature, you'll find that where human beings really operate when it comes to economics is through the laws of competition. We all know that we are all self-interested, and we operate under certain laws, like supply and demand. So why not just allow those natural laws to take place, or what we call a free and more efficient capitalist market? Women. Women's roles also began to be challenged using this rationality. The traditional view on women was that they were emotional and not true leaders. The Protestant Reformation changed this and said that women were intellectual and they were intellectual equals to men, but they had to be given a private role by God. But now this was to be challenged by the Enlightenment thinkers. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft. She challenged the very idea of a biologically determined difference between men and women. She said if you looked at the empirical evidence, the truth was that while it is true that women and men are different biologically, that doesn't mean that they're different intellectually. In other words, she challenged the difference between what's called sex and gender. By sex, what I'm talking here is biological differences. Gender is how we construct those differences. Islamic religious revival. At the same time that the Enlightenment was taking place in the scientific revolution, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab was speaking in the 1740s. He believed that the Ottoman Empire at that time period was starting to crumble, which he was correct on. In fact, the Ottoman Empire would continue to crumble all the way up until World War I, when it would completely collapse. He argued, though, that this was due to a lack of Islamic purity. He believed that the Ottomans had to go back to a complete theocracy, and a theocracy based upon the Islamic sources. This was including, in his mind, a rejection of Western technology and Western ideas. He eventually was backed by the family of Ibn Saud, and that allowed him to gain some traction within the area that is today Saudi Arabia. One of the things about Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab that a lot of people don't know about is that he really didn't call for the kinds of oppressions done to women today, even though oftentimes radical Muslims will point to this and claim that he did. There was one story in which he did call for a woman to be stoned because she had taken part in adultery. But overall, he called for women to have certain rights. For example, he supported divorce rights for women. He supported women's rights to trade, and he did not call for women to be covered the way that we are seeing today. China. The Manchus conquered China and created the Ming dynasty. Their main emperor that I want you to remember is Emperor Qianlong, who opened up China to be influenced by the Jesuits. One of the most important Jesuits was Matteo Ricci. Matteo Ricci understood that the Chinese were not going to accept Catholicism based upon Catholic practices. Rather, he would have to speak from a Chinese experience. So he would dress in Confucian gowns. He wore a long beard. And he talked about Christianity, but he talked about it within the terms of Confucianist thought. He used Western knowledge of astronomy and math in order to win over the Chinese rulers. But eventually he went so far that the Pope made these practices illegal. And when that happened, Qianlong was offended, and he threw the Jesuits out of China. In China at this time period, a man named Wang Ming argued that all individuals had a moral intuition. Now, why is this important? Well, it actually was very similar to Western thought. In fact, in many ways, Wang Ming parallels that of John Locke. If we have an individual moral intuition, that would suggest the idea of individualism itself. And he used this to revive Neo-Confucianism. Also, a movement called Caozheng was formed. Caozheng argued for the need to verify all arguments through empirical verification. Notice this was very similar to the scientific revolution. In India at this time period, India had been split between the Muslims in the north and the Hindus in the middle and the south. A new movement arose in the north called the Sikh Movement, led by Guru Nanak. He called for a syncretism of Islam and Hinduism. The idea was that there was one God, and while Islam and Hinduism may practice different ways of reaching that God, they basically worship the same God. Initially, the Sikh movement was nonviolent, but over time, the Sikh were opposed by both Islamic members and Hindu members. When they were attacked by both sides, the Sikh became far more militant. In fact, to this day, the Sikh will carry with themselves a knife that is considered to be a sacred knife. This is a symbol of the defense that the Sikhs eventually attributed because of being attacked so often. The Japanese. The Japanese continued to isolate themselves. In fact, they only opened up one port to the Dutch. During this time period, a shogunate was formed, and that shogunate was led by one military ruler who organized the island. He largely decided to cut off all Western influence. This would remain this way until 1853, when the Americans forced open the Japanese, and that led to the rise of a new dynasty called the Meiji Restoration.